And it's my pleasure now to introduce a colleague from François from London, University College London, Mary Fulbrook, who is a professor for German history there and is one of the most important, I think, linkages between British and German historiography on Germany. And she is not only a very productive scholar and the author or editor of 25 books, basically focusing on the GDR and on Nazi Germany, and some of them are also comparative books. But she's also, like, she serves at advisory boards at commemoration sites of Buchenwald and Mittelbau-Dora and other German foundations. So she will now, I mean, I will not, read now the titles of her books. You have it in the conference map. But I would give a very warm welcome to Mary, who will now talk about the bystanders, which in my eyes is one of the most important subjects when we deal with Nazi history. Mary, the floor is yours.
It's wonderful to be here in the presence of people who are not merely engaged with this in a scholarly way, but also on a very personal level. Perhaps right at the very start I could say my own personal connection to this. I owe it to Kristallnacht that my eldest half-brother, who is very much older than me, he was born in 1936, was actually brought out of Berlin in January 1939 after his grandfather. He was staying with his grandparents. My mother had left for England already and left this little baby with his grandparents. His grandfather was arrested, taken to Sachsenhausen. When he came out of Sachsenhausen, knew he had to try and get the family out. And so my brother, my half-brother, arrived with a one-way ticket, a visa, in January 1939 at the tender age of 3, and in my view he's been affected for the rest of his life by this babyhood experience of which he has no memory, but it certainly has affected the whole of the rest of his life, and I think that is true of everyone who is touched by these events. Unfortunately, his grandfather went back and didn't get the rest of that family out, so that was the end of them later on, but that's a different story. Okay, so I'm interested in the question of bystanders because it's quite obvious who the victims were, but there's been a big debate among German historians about what was the response of the German population. What I will do is very briefly, I have 20 minutes, I understand, even though we're running a little late. I'll very briefly give you an overview of where I think the historiography is. I will then talk about 2 different routes to passivity or bystanding, and then I will see where I think that left the situation in those awful days in November 1938, so that I think we can try and understand the background to how this was possible. And I phrase this, or I want to situate this in the context of a comment, a memorable sentence by Ian Kershaw, that great historian of Nazi Germany and biographer of Hitler, where, as you may remember, at the end of one of his books, he says, excuse me, I left my water somewhere miles away, so somebody can find me a glass, that'd be great. At the end of one of his books, he says, the road to Auschwitz may have been built by hatred, but it was paved by indifference. And it's on that indifference that I want to focus. There's been a little bit of a debate about, was it indifference, or was it, as Otto Dov Kulke and others have said, complicity? And I think it's actually much more complex than either of those things. It's not merely indifference, it's not merely complicity, it's both those, and it's more. Thanks. Wonderful. So historical approaches, first of all. We've got a lot of sources about how Germans responded to Kristallnacht, from official state and party reports through critical commentaries by regime opponents, the exiled Social Democratic Party, eyewitness accounts from a large variety of perspectives. We've already heard about the Wiener Library collection that Ruth Levitt and others worked on. And despite this incredible richness of sources, of memories, of the kind of witness testimony, the survivor testimony that we saw some of this morning, we still don't know really, we don't have a good, adequate picture of how ordinary Germans, if you can use that expression, responded to these events. And I think the historians divide really into 2 quite distinct groups. On the one hand, there are many historians who identify ways in which Germans disapproved of these events. Ian Kershaw and many others comment on the widespread expressions of shock at the destruction of property. David Bankier famously discussed the ways in which people registered they were ashamed to be German. Ich schäme mich, Deutsch zu sein. Bankier also points out to the egoistic concerns of many Germans about the ways in which business might be adversely affected by Germany being viewed critically in the eyes of the wider world. So this wasn't just a humanitarian response of shock, it was also, oh my God, our business is going to suffer as a result of this. Wolf-Arno Kropat points out that people were critical not only of the destruction of material goods, but also of the inhumanity of the rabble. And talks about the ways in which many people saw this violence as unworthy of the German cultural nation, the Kulturnation, amounting to a break with national culture. But on the other hand, a recent tendency among historians, including Alan Steinweiss, who unfortunately couldn't be here because he's talking in Berlin this week. I've just come from Lessons and Legacies with him, and our planes were going in opposite directions. I had breakfast with him yesterday and said, what are you doing not coming this way? And he said, because I'm going to Frankfurt and Berlin that way, and had agreed to speak there. But Alan Steinweiss, as you'll know in his remarkable book based on post-war trials, emphasises the sheer extent of popular participation on the side of the perpetrators. So we've had already emphasised by Francois and seen in the pictures the importance of people in uniform, the black-shirted SS, the brown-shirted SA. But in addition, what Steinweiss's research on post-war trials shows is the sheer extent of further participation. The eyewitness accounts repeatedly emphasise, as we would expect, members of the Hitler Youth, young people, but Steinweiss shows that even ordinary school children were brought along. Teachers brought their whole school classes with them, a nice outing on an ordinary school day to come and help jeer and humiliate the Jews, to help stand around in the ruins of burnt-out synagogues or the destroyed shops and so on, and actually laugh and shout the slogans and be part of the crowd that was on the side of the perpetrators. So I talked a little bit to Alan Steinweiss yesterday at breakfast, saying, how do you square this with, on the other hand, somebody like Dieter Obst, who's written one of the most extensive, comprehensive analyses of popular responses to Kristallnacht. And if you read Obst, I reminded myself of what he'd read earlier this week. I looked at his book again, and in Obst accounts you get the impression that the German people were lovely. They were all trying to help the Jews. There are a couple of sections in his book about neighbours, passers-by, friends, other people not related to individual Jews, all offering shelter to Jews whose homes have been destroyed, offering food to Jews, and so on. So Obst, on the one hand, saying people were being helpful, providing assistance, and Steinweiss, on the other hand, saying, actually, no, so many people were engaged on the side of the perpetrators. So all of this suggests we need much more detailed, more differentiated analysis of what's going on among the German public and how does this affect what happens. One of the things that I would like to note is that most of the historiography to date on Kristallnacht that's focused very neatly on the time of the events has looked at attitudes to specific aspects, so destruction of property, for example, and what did people think of that? What I would like to suggest is that we should zoom out a little bit and look at the ways in which social relations have changed over the preceding years in Germany, such that German society itself has been engaged in a process not merely of reaction to the regime, as in the state society kinds of approaches, but the German society itself has been engaged in a process of self-transformation as people have started to see others differently and behave towards others differently, and that approach may help us to tease out with a little bit more differentiation what actually was going on that helps to explain why people behaved the way they did in November 1938, the non-Jewish Germans, the Aryan Germans. And what I'm doing in a wider project on bystanders is I'm trying to plot bystander behaviour on a 5-point scale. You can be a bystander very momentarily at the middle point of the scale where there is a perpetrator, there is a victim, and you witness it. But within moments, you have to take a decision. Do you walk away, not see, not know? Do you smile at the victim or even try and intervene on behalf of the victim or try and call authorities to assist? Or do you smile, jeer, humiliate, be on the side of the perpetrators, even go in and loot and plunder? So this spectrum is very mobile, very rapidly moving. What determines action or inaction? What determines which direction you go in? And what I think we can see in the course of the 1930s is a movement from the April boycott of 1933, where people tended not to be so much on the side of the perpetrators and to be more willing to demonstrate support for victims, not least because they wanted to go in and buy stuff from the shop where they normally bought it, to a situation in November 1938 where people are more likely to remain passive, to not speak up, to perhaps mutter expressions of disapproval, or to be active on the side of the perpetrators. There is a distinct shift that one can see. And I don't want to generalise too simplistically, but I think one can trace this. So what I think in terms of the argument between Ian Kershaw, Otto Dov-Gulke and others is as follows. I think it's not just indifference, Kershaw's phrase about indifference. Kershaw defines indifference as lack of interest. It's not just indifference. It's actually both complicity and constraint and fear. There is something much more active going on. I think a degree of complicity was prior to 1938. I think fear also led to passivity. So let me move through the social production of these two things, the social production of ignorance and indifference. I think we have to move beyond anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism is clearly important, but there is more going on in the 1930s. Nazi policies set in motion significant shifts such that people had to start thinking in newly racialized terms. If you look at Berlin, for example, in the early 1930s, many intermarried families, Maximilian will shortly be talking about intermarriage in Munich families, but it's a very assimilated German Jewish community. People thought in terms of religion, but not radical racial difference. In the course of the 1930s, people had to start thinking in terms of being an Aryan and non-Aryan. And in the process, many people dropped friendships. I can give you innumerable examples. I'll just quote from one essay written in 1939. So many friends whom we'd known for decades, they all sooner or later turned their backs on us. We had the feeling, it is true, that they were not completely convinced that what they were doing was right, but they adjusted themselves. To observe this, to experience this, was very painful for us. A few exceptions remained steadfast. These exceptions were indeed those who saved our lives. So that is a Munich Jew who had been totally integrated, very friendly with many other people, but her friends turned their backs on her. Those included in the majority Aryan society were in effect complicit in creating a divide, which became a divide that was not merely social, turning your back on your friends, but became increasingly physical. After the Nuremberg laws, when you could no longer employ Aryans under the age of 45 in a household of Jews, increasingly Jews were having to move if they were in a housing block where there was I won't spell out all the details, but you can imagine this, there was an increasing physical isolation as well as an increasing social isolation. So learned indifference becomes crucial. This is not rabid ideological anti-Semitism. This is simply dropping contacts and then becoming indifferent to the fate of people with whom you're no longer in close contact, with whom you're no longer very friendly. And learned indifference and learned ignorance means you don't really know what's happening to them. There's another thing going on. however, this is my third point, the social production of passivity or inaction. The last was the social production of indifference and ignorance. This is the social production of inactivity, passivity. By 1938, the leeway for effective personal agency has changed massively. The years in which Jews were being progressively isolated also had an impact on members of the majority Aryan community. And I think with our focus on the history of Jews, we forget that the nature of German Aryan society was also changing. I'll just give you another couple of quotes. There's the growth of mutual distrust. There's a fear of denunciation. There's decreasing willingness to admit to having an alternative view. And in my reading of many sources, we see people conforming through their external behaviour and acting what's required of them in the relevant places, going and doing the Heil Hitler while muttering, the snow lay this high that year, so hoch lag der Schnee, so that you don't feel you're doing Heil Hitler. You feel you're still being true to your inner self, but you're still doing the outward conformity. There's a pressure for conformity. And just to quote from another of these 1939 essays that I've been working with, one of the writers noted that the majority of those he knew when he visited, when he was living in Berlin, were, quote, tired and intimidated. And when he went to stay in the summer of 36 in a small Bavarian village, he commented that the population was, quote, extremely cautious with respect to politics. The one observed the other, so that most of them only offered the Hitler greeting out of a sense of fear. Back in Berlin by October, he registered that the atmosphere was much changed and one did not see many people laughing anymore. Another one, talking about his experiences in Berlin, talks about how all his acquaintances talk of little else but, quote, problems of justice, freedom, honour and conscience. But they pose the question of whether they could still look at themselves in the mirror without throwing up, because they had become such a pig, a Schweinehund. So people are feeling that they are suffering what this particular character calls mental and spiritual death. And by 1939, this particular author comments, most of his acquaintances had become Nazis. Many simply had begun to pretend that they had reached Nazi opinions of their own free will, rather than simply parroting Nazi propaganda. He, quote, they no longer tried to form their own opinions, but had decided finally to fall into line themselves. And I could give you many, many more quotes like this, but one of the people who decides to emigrate, an Aryan, says that we wanted to emigrate because we were concerned about the future of our children, the prospect that we could see them grow up in freedom and with equality of opportunity, the certainty that we would not have to engage in deceit and lies every day. But if you read through these sources for what's going on in the bystander community, you find expressions of apathy, resignation, a sense of unease, inner unease, a feeling you have to conform. What does this mean for the events of November 38? During the night of 9th, 10th November and during the following days, young people were readily mobilised. And again, the sources show again and again the younger generation throughout the 30s is the most easily socialised and mobilised into support for Nazism. So young people were readily mobilised to engage in violence, particularly steeped in Nazi propaganda. It's also notable that there were very many people willing to engage in self-enrichment, plundering, looting, taking stuff. And although you can find examples later of people saying, I only went in to take my neighbour's property to keep it safe for them so I could give it back later, well, how far do we believe those? It may be true in some cases. I doubt that it's true in the majority of cases. I think most prevalent when you look at bystander responses in November 38 is a position of what I see as unhappy passivity. One person characterises reactions as a feeling of deep depression and shame. And many people admit or say, and we've seen this in so many sources, they're now ashamed to be German. But I think even though we can see examples, and I've got several which I won't take you through, even though we can see examples of being warned by friends of impending arrests, or being given shelter by friends, or being helped to get out by friends, I think there's something more interesting going on in this sense of shame. A shame to be German is not just, as one person puts it, that he can no longer feel a member of a nation or a state that commits this in the name of the people. If that's what the German state says is in the name of the people, he no longer feels German. This is an Aryan who emigrates willingly because he no longer feels he can be a German. It's not only that. I think some of the shame, saying I'm ashamed to be German, arises from a deep sense of being ashamed yourself, that you had been complicit in getting to this point, that you had yourself dropped your former friends, you'd dropped your acquaintances, you'd not protested against their exclusion from your leisure associations, your sports and social associations. You'd not kicked up a fuss when they'd lost their jobs, when they'd been kicked out of their professions. So it's a shame which is a shame about yourself and not just ashamed to be German. And it's easier to say you're ashamed to be German because it's not I'm ashamed to be me. But I think there was that deep sense among many people that I've come across in these sources. So let me conclude. On the basis of the particular sources I've looked at, I think you can see that the Nazi movement, and this is quite important because this relates to what we are experiencing today, not only in America with Pittsburgh last week, but also in Britain with Brexit and many of the things that have been happening in Britain about visas and so on. The Nazi movement had introduced a hostile environment and had initiated practical measures from violence through legislation to establish the desired people's community, the Volksgemeinschaft. And by being largely compliant with this environment, for whatever reasons, fear, not wanting to lose your job, careerism, professional considerations, all sorts of reasons, the majority of those who were included in the Volksgemeinschaft had further transformed themselves, in the process creating an even more hostile environment. We can talk perhaps about the differences, the contrasts between Trump and Hitler. They are massive differences. But I think in the creation of a hostile environment and complicity in creating a hostile environment, there is something that is still worth talking about here. So in the process, Germans had created an even more hostile environment, one in which it was possible to carry out terror, not merely overnight, but in broad daylight, without significant unrest or intervention on behalf of the persecuted, and indeed with a lot of popular participation benefiting from the results of that terror. Living within the Third Reich was not only a matter of reacting to policies according to different specific values or attitudes or interests, it was also a process of enacting the Nazi community over a period of time, to such an extent that many people gradually became able to believe in their own performances, while for others there was a continuing underlying sense of discomfort about compromises that had been entered into and unease about the outcome, while at the same time being too fearful to act in any way other than conforming while expressing shame. These experiences and emotions would feed into the decades of unease about the Nazi past in post-war discourse. So returning to the argument I introduced at the start, I would suggest that it's way too simple to pose this simply in terms of hatred and indifference, as Ian Kershaw did. Rather, I think we have to build in complicity, we have to build in prior complicity in making it possible, and we also have to build in the question of inaction and passivity rooted in constraint, repression, terror and fear, and return to having a much more wide and differentiated picture, not simply speaking about the Germans or German society, but actually trying to understand the many processes that were at work in those fateful dozen years of Nazi rule prior to the unleashing of this terror and the genocide that was to follow. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mary, for this really very inspiring analysis. I mean, and you gave us many thoughts on this, and I would just like to make one comment pointing out to two factors which I think, which you mentioned, but I would like to pinpoint them again. I mean, we must be aware of that. I mean, since 1933, the regime had been arresting and persecuting and sending into exile tens of thousands of members of the German workers' movement. I mean, they are natural opponents. So, I mean, there was many people. And then it's tens of thousands who were in concentration camps in 1938. And if you think about their families and friends and so on, so it's it's an amount of people who probably would have been an important group as far as bystanders or resistance is concerned. That's one point. And I think the other point, which I think is equally important, is to be aware of the fact that in 1938, the Nazis were at the top of their international power. In this year, they had managed, Austria was annexed, the Sudetenland. So on an international level, this was a very powerful country, which also leads us, I think, when we think about today, to the fact that when a country is very powerful, and obviously they can do whatever they want as far as internal politics is concerned, this also, has an effect on the inhabitants of this country, who feel internally and from the outside in a difficult position. But this is just a comment, and the floor is open now, please.
Thank you very much. It was fascinating, and I completely agree. I just wanted to say that
Just wait for, yeah.
Thank you. That maybe the first step towards recognizing the complexity of the popular responses is by dismantling the term bystanders. Because we know from Raoul Hilberg's work and of course contemporary research that this term, if we talk about terminology, this term is very problematic. Nowadays we talk about onlookers, witnesses, gainers, perpetrators, rescuers of course, and even people who begin as onlookers and then become gainers or perpetrators. So by dismantling this term and maybe even not using it, we can understand this complexity very much better. Thank you.
Okay, you can, since there are no... Yeah.
Yep. Yeah, that's precisely what my project is about. And in fact, there's a new book coming out edited by Crine Thies and Tina Marina on bystanders, where I've got a piece where I'm trying to do precisely that. I think it's really crucial to understand that within a system of collective violence, systemic collective violence that persists over time, it is impossible to consider people as bystanders in the way that you can if there's a campus rape, for example. Campus rape, USC, somebody going down this beautiful campus, you can say bystanders, okay, they can intervene, they can call the police, whatever. I think in a system of systemic violence persisting over time, the character of the surrounding population is not adequately caught by that. Raoul Hilberg, in fact, castigates the entire German people as being complicit, being part of the persecutory Tätergesellschaft. I don't think that's helpful either. I think Raoul Hilberg's, his book was great. There's a moral indictment of inaction, but it's lousy conceptually. You look at the bunch of different things he's got, the churches, helpers, foreign nations, whatnot. His bystander category is a ragbag for anything else that he wanted to talk about at that point. But I don't think it's helpful to consider the whole of German society as a Tätergesellschaft, as a perpetrator society, as Raoul Hilberg suggests when he does talk about German society there. And picking up on Stefanie's point, I think it's really important to understand that many people, in fact in my more detailed work I go into the issue of agency and knowledge and whether you're structurally able to do anything or not. There's a very interesting notion of what makes a moral bystander, somebody who both has the capacity to act and knows what's going on. And if you don't have the capacity to act because you were arrested and put into Dachau in March 33 when it was opened, you're not going to be very good as a bystander come November 38. So yes, it's an immensely complex and problematic term. It's nevertheless one which people use repeatedly, and that's why I think we need to have a good conceptual approach to thinking about it, and why I'm trying to develop this spectrum. I think it's not a stable category at all, but I think the way in which people who are not immediately involved in a situation of conflict react to that makes a crucial difference to the outcome of that, and therefore we still have to think about it in some way.
Over there, yes, please.
If I may, or is somebody else?
No.
Okay.
No.
All right. Thank you very much for this. I have to say I'm a bit troubled. I'm troubled about the term, with respect to the terms indifference, ignorance, learned indifference, learned ignorance. It's my sense that it does not emphasize the modality of enabling, and the very modes of pleasure that, what does it mean to be looking onto violence that's being enacted and in a certain way gleefully, voyeuristically, potentially even participating. There's an entire range of emotions that I think needs to be discussed in terms of what kind of social recognition do I gain from being in that space that is sanctioned by an enactment, as you said. An enactment is exactly the precise term, an enactment of Nazi violence that in which I potentially, from which I may derive pleasure in some weird, potentially sadomasochistic sense even. And I think I understand that we are here in territory that is potentially speculative, but I think we must be talking about lives of affect, or let's say masculinity, and what does it mean to be enacting what violence and other, and what does it mean to be looking on while violence is being enacted. And so I feel that we actually need to bring in models of recognition, What does it mean to be in that space in terms of larger social psychology and collective models of psychology?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. I only use the learned indifference and the learned ignorance because I want to emphasize that we don't have to bang on about pre-existing anti-Semitism. There is more for some people, or there is something different for some people. I think the social psychology of what goes on during the events itself is really crucial. One of the interesting things is to compare large communities with small communities and to see how, quote I didn't use in talking to you from the longer paper, but to see how in small communities you would think, my hypothesis would have been, had I not read enough, that you would think in a small community where the Jews are your friends, your neighbours, your colleagues, the people in whose store you bought stuff or you traded cattle with or whatever, you would think you wouldn't want to engage in violence against them. And yet in small rural communities, more of the population seem to have got caught up in a mob frenzy and gone along with the crowd and run down the streets jeering and laughing and so on. So there is a social psychology at work for active participation, which is a different matter from the passivity and the ashamed to be German and so on. And you get far more of the standing silently staring with a combination of disbelief, shame, horror in a large community like Berlin, where you can get many, many reports of people just standing staring silently at the smouldering remains of a synagogue, or muttering and then providing supportive comments to their Jewish neighbours when they get home, when the Jews come home from wherever they've been hiding or come back from concentration camp. The concierge or the local storeholder will actually mutter sympathy. So there's something clearly very important about the social psychology of different responses, and we have to look at that. And as I've said, this is a very wide spectrum from positive participation at one end to complete sympathy and assistance at the other end. And social psychology plays a big role in it, affect and emotion, no doubt whatsoever.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I will start collecting now. Now it's your, and then it's I got you. Yeah.
Good. I think the concept of learned indifference is really interesting and important. But I'm curious in terms of bystanders. Does that include enabling institutions, whether it's corporations that are involved, and people, executives behind that, and their liability? And if so, where's the liability? Because you have issues of forcing corporate bail, and if it's a government agency for sovereign immunity. So I'm just curious where individuals fit within that.
So now it's the lady. Excuse me. We are collecting. So please, the lady over there.
chain, but I would say that this is the reason.
Sorry, I missed that.
This is the reason of acting out and having Kristallnacht. The shame, the Mind of Germany, the book, The Mind of Germany, writes about the mentality of the young generation that you mentioned, young people who are participating, and he discusses the effect that those are children of the orphans, of soldiers of a generation that grew up without fathers because they were killed in World War I. They're looking for pride. They're ashamed. They have no identity. And if you go back in Mind of Germany and you go back to Barbarossa, you go back through history, pride is a very important thing. Hitler eventually gives them the cause, the reason to be proud. They are not bystanders. They're looking for a himmlische Führer. They're looking for a solution. For them, this is a dream come true. They're not just staying there quietly.
Okay.
And we go back to the question, who made whom? Which came first, the chicken or the egg?
Okay.
Kristallnacht was a dream come true.
Thank you. May you answer? We have no more.
Okay, so two questions, both effectively about perpetrators rather than about bystanders. The enabling institutions, the ministries, the government agencies, I actually think that one of the problems with the historiography of the Third Reich has been, for many years, the image of the Third Reich. It's not what historians have been doing, but the image, the popular image of the Third Reich, has been to see the Nazis as essentially Hitler, the party agencies and affiliated organisations and so on. And over the last couple of decades, at least in the historical scholarship, we've been exploring more and more and more the significance of the state, the way in which the state worked along with the party. The ministries were complicit in so many ways. I think one of the significant problems is that from 1934 onwards at the latest, the army was committed to the Hitler project. So we have party and state at one going in the same direction with differences of opinion about particular things and differences of strategy, but basically running in the same direction. We want to make Germany great again. Sorry, but you know, Germany first. No contemporary echoes intended here. So that is, I would say, on the side of the perpetrators. Now, there is a clear difference between those people who are shocked at the rabble Nazis and the thugs and the people who go out and do the physical violence, and those people who are nevertheless constructing the preconditions to enable such violence to take place and to enable in wartime the exploitation, the massive exploitation of slave labour, the army of concentration camps and so on, in order to support the German war effort. So I think it's really very much more complex, and we have to understand there are an awful lot of different powers and forces on the side of the perpetrators there. So liability, I think you used the word liability. I think there's a lot of liability, and I think they got away with it after the war, and I think if we look at post-war justice, the professional civil service managed to evade being brought to account, while the thugs who manned the the SS guards and so on, who manned concentration camps, were designated perpetrators, and everyone else shrank into the shadows and nothing to do with it. We wouldn't do nasty violence at the front line, you know. So it's a very, very much more complex picture if we're looking at who is guilty, who is a perpetrator. And that goes exactly to this question of pride and shame, because what you're addressing there is not my bystander people who say they were ashamed to be German. You're addressing the issue of those who are only too happy to get involved in the violence, who charged in gleefully saying, well, we heard it in one of the eyewitness comments at the beginning, having to go in saying hang the Jews, and so that committed youth. I think it's quite dangerous to go down the route of one of the things you suggested about fatherless from the First World War, because in fact when you look at the first Hitler Youth generation, they're generally born from around 1918 to 1925. The people who were very, very active in the 1930s, so they're not necessarily fatherless from the First World War. But the First World War was important in a much wider sense, the sense of national humiliation and wanting to return pride to Germany, return Germany to national greatness. I wouldn't put it down to the psychodynamics of the individual family so much as the way in which it was used, the narrative was used for political mobilization by the Nazi Party. And you're absolutely right about that. So that for the young people, it's very, very evident in many, many sources in the 1930s how families are really split, that parents are shocked and horrified in the mid-1930s about what their 16-year-old son is coming home and saying and doing. They dare not speak in front of their 12-year-old for fear their 12-year-old will go back and say it in school the next day. This is a generation born in the early years of the Weimar Republic who's witnessed the collapse of the economy and the political disintegration and the difficulties of the late Weimar years, the Depression, and sees Hitler as the saviour, the solution, and therefore feels mobilised to go into it with energy and vigour and the enjoyment of youth, that being engaged in something big, you know.
Okay, one last question, short question.
Yeah,
No, it's
very short. So throughout your talk, which was really fascinating, there's one sort of category that perhaps would be interesting to throw in is the concept of benefit. Because people were beneficiaries even if they did nothing. And so how does this, the various elements of this larger society reap real or imagined benefits from this kind of action? And certainly the history of slavery in the United States, you end up realizing that everybody benefited from it, no matter who they were, and they could be a fisherman in Maine, and they benefited from the existence of slavery. So how, if you add into the category of, the various categories, the beneficiaries, and then to parse that down into the nature of those benefits reaped?
okay.
Yeah. I think you can make a distinction. I wrote a paper actually once about Hitler's willing functionaries and witting beneficiaries. I think there's a distinction between people who go in to benefit, who go in to loot and plunder and steal and take, and people who benefit less wittingly through, but many, many people were beneficiaries of the exclusion of Jews from German society right from 1933 onwards, the law for the professionalization of a civil service, people get jobs that Jews have vacated and so on, the quote Aryanization of property at knockdown rates, the emigration of Jews. There are so many people who are beneficiaries, and this is one of the interesting things about post-war German society. Going through to the present, people who are children and grandchildren of those who are beneficiaries of the Nazi treatment of the Jews, some of them with an extremely high sense of morality and guilty conscience, wanting to give back. In fact, one of Albert Speer's children, Hilda Schramm, has actually set up an organisation entitled Giving Back, because she feels that people who benefited should actually now give something back. I think you can see it in a much broader sense, the second and third generation Germans, the Germans of today, with a very high sense of moral responsibility. I think you can even see it in someone like Angela Merkel, with her notion of refugees are welcome, unlike just about everywhere else in the world. So the morality that has arisen from that beneficiaries is very, very important. When you look at the time of itself, the beneficiaries immediately around Kristallnacht, which is what this particular conference is focusing on, I think a lot of people benefited very rapidly and later did not wish to remember it. So you compare oral history accounts and memoirs written in the 1990s and 2000s with what we know of the time, and nobody says anything other than, oh yes, I heard something was going on and I was told the synagogue had burned the other side of town, but I didn't really see anything, or I walked by and I saw. Not a single person in an oral history interview says, yeah, and I ran into the store and we managed to nick 5 pairs of shoes and my mother brought home this fantastic whatever. I haven't come across that in a single oral history interview. Nobody remembers the benefiting, but we know it took place at the time. So it's a very complex subject which has affected the whole of post-war German history to the present day.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Mary, for making a very complex story somehow a little bit more understandable, I think. Thank you very, very much for this insight. And we now come to our second speaker on this panel, which is my colleague Maximilian Strnad from Munich. He is working, I'll keep on talking while you are moving. He's a historian at the Munich City Archive, and he has been involved in many university and community-based research undertakings regarding the Jewish history of Munich in the 1930s, 40s, and in the post-war time. And he is the author of 2 books on the subject of persecution history of Munich. And these 2 books were published before his PhD, which is not so usual. And he now he finished his PhD. Now, I'm saying finally because I'm really looking forward to read the book, which will be out, I hope, next year. And in his book, he's dealing with the subject of mixed marriages and the persecution of mixed marriages, which basically led him to deal with everything as far as persecution of Jews in Germany and also in the post-war time is concerned. So it's a very comprehensive story, and today we will hear one part of it, which is the gendered reactions to the violence of the November terror. I'm learning now the new terminology. Please.
In the introduction, yes, the project is finished, but the book isn't out, so I'm happy to present you one chapter out of it, and I'm very happy to be here. Reading memoirs, diaries, and correspondence from members of mixed marriages, it is striking that mainly families with Jewish husbands are reporting from personal experience of violence or excessive violence during Kristallnacht, while those with Jewish women in general are referring only to violence that happened to others, namely to their Jewish relatives and friends. Certainly, this finding does not apply to every single source, but reading some dozen documents of different nature written by intermarried Jews, such as their family members, and looking into at least 100 of their compensation files from all over Germany, a general rule seems to be evident. To demonstrate why the experience of violence in mixed marriages during Kristallnacht was highly gendered, I will first analyze the general line of attack by taking a closer look to the spaces where violence mainly was executed on November 9th and on the following days. It is important to understand that the access to different social spheres and spaces for intermarried couples was per se closely related to the sex of its Jewish part. Therefore, I will shortly cross-reference the situation of intermarried Jews under Nazi rule. Finally, it is my intention to show how the members of mixed marriages reacted to Kristallnacht and how this experience affected their agency, once more under the very special focus of gender. Let me first give you a quick introduction in the situation of intermarried couples in fall 1938. With the Nuremberg laws in 1935, the regime prohibited weddings between Jews and non-Jews. Existing mixed marriages were not dissolved by force, but Nazi officials increased pressure on them in order to get them to divorce. Gentile partners had to accept restrictions at work or even lost their position for being related to a Jew. Many Gentile friends and family members, as we heard already, turned their backs on intermarried couples. Gestapo and party officials openly blackmailed the Gentile parts to leave their spouses in order to free themselves from persecution. All mixed marriages had to suffer persecution, but the anti-Jewish measures had far more effect on families with Jewish breadwinners, which mainly were the male parts at that time. They were hit by economic sanctions with full force, and the Gentile woman often had only little possibilities to compensate the losses of income and social security, even if many of them tried. But Jewish man, Gentile woman couples were also hardly attacked for ideological reasons. German women, or let's rather say German mothers, were considered as preservers of the German race. Children of such liaisons, the so-called Mischlinge, or half-breeds, had a Nazi ideology nor value to the Volksgemeinschaft. This is why the regime pressurized exceptionally on those families. A significant number of mixed marriages did not stand up to this pressure, but in mid-1938 the majority remained intact. I will come back to the consequences of Kristallnacht on the divorce rate of mixed marriages later. As a start, let's take a look on how the events of the night, in the night from November 9th to 10th affected intermarried families. Nazi leadership only made exceptions from persecution to a part of the mixed marriages after November 9th. With Hitler's approval, Hermann Göring created in late December 1938 the category of privileged mixed marriages. Abusing the meaning of privilege, families with Gentile husbands and families with children who had raised non-Jewish were exempted because of their ties to the Volksgemeinschaft, for example, from being ghettoized. The Jewish spouse did not have to wear the yellow badge and was not subordinated to food restrictions. Before that moment, all laws, measures, and actions always were directed against all Jews. This was also the case on Kristallnacht. As far as we know, there were no instructions on how to treat intermarried Jews. They were neither exempted nor treated in a special way. The reasons why intermarried Jewish men and their families were hit comparatively harder as families with Gentile men is not to be searched for in special orders, but in the general line of attack during Kristallnacht. Taking into consideration what spaces were mainly under attack, the gender-specific impact of Kristallnacht on mixed marriages becomes more obvious. Nazi perpetrators performed violence not solely to Jewish men that night, but many examples show that also a large number of women was affected. In fact, brutal force was often even directed explicitly against Jewish women, as we will see later. But the general line of attack was against Jewish property and against its mainly male owners, in order to destroy the livelihood of Jews in Germany and to force emigration. Subsequent to the brutal attacks on companies, shops, and houses, not to talk about the burning synagogues and demolished Jewish institutions, the Gestapo arrested in a nationwide raid Jewish men and brought them into concentration camps in order to press them to abandon their businesses, sell their assets, and leave Germany immediately. Under these roundabout 30,000 persons were also many intermarried men. This raid brought a second wave of violence directly into their homes, as we will see later in Wolf Gruner's paper. In regard to the mixed marriages, these preconditions were of central relevance for the question who was affected. Indeed, also some shop owned by intermarried non-Jews were destroyed and looted on November 9th, and some had to close for a short while afterwards. But most of them were spared, even if they were situated in a Jewish neighborhood. Also, Gentile men were not to be arrested in their homes during the following raids. Nevertheless, it has to be clarified that also intermarried Jewish women and their families became victims mainly of violence conducted towards their homes during the events in the night from November 9th to November 10th, such as in Frankfurt, where invaders threw the furniture of the Lehr family out of the windows of their flat. This was especially the case in rural communities or smaller towns where the violence was directed against all remaining Jews. In Immenhausen, near Kassel for example, some drunken SR men threw a brick through the window of the Jahn family's home. Same in Solingen, where the local SR leader extended the nightly hunt for Jews on intermarried women after his brigade had finished their bloody work against all other Jews in town. They even demolished the house of a Gentile man who was divorced from a Jewess and threatened him in order to get hold on his ex-wife, which they assumed was hiding in his place, but she didn't. Let's take a closer look to the private space where until Kristallnacht many Jews had found shelter from the hostility of the outer world. As violence reached their homes, their illusions of security was fundamentally destroyed. Jews were not only attacked in their private sphere during the violent events of Kristallnacht itself, when police officers, often accompanied by SS and SR men, were knocking on their doors in order to arrest all Jewish men between the age of 16 and 60, the entire family was in great danger. The perpetrators used the opportunity to extend the actions against the Jews who had been officially ended in the morning of November 10th. In Memmingen, a small town in southern Germany, a horde of local SR men entered by force the house of the Guggenheimer family. They not only arrested Alfred Guggenheimer, but also smashed the whole furniture, all windows and the flatware, slashed the sofas and blankets, and even cut the entire underwear in pieces. The intrusion often was a life-threatening situation. Many intermarried men were badly injured, some even murdered. In Berlin, Friedrich Wilhelm Bloch was shot when members of the SA came to arrest him on November 11th. After she returned home, the murderers told his non-Jewish wife, Lotte, that he committed suicide. These situations also were very dangerous for the Gentile family members. Lotte Bloch was arrested immediately and put in Gestapo prison for several months. We do not know if she was mistreated, because her statement does not shed light on this situation. But in other cases, severe attacks on Gentile wives are well documented. Some houses next to Alfred Guggenheimer in Memmingen, Hugo Günzberger's wife was beaten by SR men when they came to arrest him. In Munich, a group of unknown men assaulted Heinrich Obermeier and his non-Jewish wife on November 10th in their apartment. They both were badly beaten with a cudgel, and Mrs. Obermeier lost her left eye as a direct result of the mistreatment. In Kleinmachnow near Berlin, a Mischling was arrested and detained in custody for some days because the policemen could not lay their hand on his Jewish father, who had decided to go hiding after a non-Jewish colleague had warned him of the forthcoming arrests. A couple of hours before, the SR had smashed all windows of the house where Harry Löwenberg, that was his name, and his family lived. We do not know how many intermarried Jews were arrested nationwide on Kristallnacht and on the following days, but one can accept that their number was prominent. Jewish men between 30 and 65 were above average married to Gentile women. In Munich, every sixth Jew who was arrested and detained in the Dachau concentration camp in late 1938 was intermarried. Needless to say that also many of those who were beaten to death or who perished due to the catastrophic conditions in the crowded special camps for Jews were intermarried too. One of them was the 37-year-old typesetter Theodor Oppenheimer from Frankfurt, who died in the Buchenwald concentration camp. From end of November on, the remaining prisoners were released. The historian and survivor Harry Stein argued in his publications that intermarried Jews were with the first group of prisoners to be set free by the SS. But there is no evidence for this argument. Indeed, former combatants of the World War I were released first. Many of them were intermarried. Maybe this is why fellow prisoners got the impression that intermarried Jews were privileged. But statistics from Munich show again that most of the detained intermarried Jews were in fact released from mid-December on, together with the majority of all other prisoners from Dachau concentration camp. As shown, the impact of violence was in general much higher on mixed marriages with a Jewish male householder. The reactions of intermarried families also significantly depended on gender. At the end of my presentation, I will give you some short impressions on how intermarried Jews responded to the caesura of Kristallnacht. Just as Harry Löwenberg, many Jewish men had avoided arrest by going underground. For several weeks, the Gestapo was searching the streets for hidden Jews and frequently came back to their homes. We know that many men found shelter in the homes of elderly Jews who were not affected by the raid, and in the homes of families whose husbands had already been arrested and where the police probably would not come back again. Sometimes also non-Jewish friends offered shelter. Intermarried Jewish men often had good opportunities to exile Gentile spaces in order to wait for the end of the raid, because they could not only refer to friends and former colleagues, but also to Gentile family members and their friends. Similar to Harry Löwenherz, who for a couple of days visited non-Jewish family members in a nearby town, Eduard Meyer, together with his Gentile wife and a newborn baby, just a couple of days old, left Düsseldorf straight after the SR men had intruded the family's flat and brutally mistreated him with steel roots. Meyer was seriously injured and had a strong concussion when they drove by car, to the Munich hinterland, where his sister-in-law gave them asylum. It is well known that the shocking experience of Kristallnacht resulted in a wave of mass immigration. 10,000 of Jews sought to leave the country immediately after the 9th of November. While only few intermarried Jewish wives emigrated, a large number of intermarried Jewish men left Germany. In Munich, 255 out of nearly 1,100 Jews who emigrated were intermarried. 215 of them were men, only 40 were women. Jewish men and their families were not only affected to a much higher degree from the events of Kristallnacht in special. As shown before, the economic impact of persecution in general was more severe for them as for intermarried Jewish women and their families. The latter still had much to lose, and so they often backed off from the idea of starting over a new life elsewhere, and at the same time paying more than a quarter of their fortune for the Reich's flight tax to obtain the right to leave. Additionally, the non-Jewish husbands and half-Jewish sons could not legally immigrate when they were military aged. Only very few women choose to emigrate by their own, leaving husbands and kids behind. Kristallnacht had in two ways a dramatic effect on the integrity of mixed marriages. Due to the imminent threat of being detained in a concentration camp, many Jewish men, intermarried or not alike, had to leave the country immediately. Often it was impossible to get all the visas and collect enough money for all family members. So some couples decided to send the jeopardized men first because, and I quote, "The Aryan woman and half-children did not have to fear serious danger at the time being," as the Alp family after the war explained their decision process back in 1938. For the non-Jewish wives, who had to manage all the necessary arrangements for their imprisoned men, this often was a farewell for a very long time. For different reasons that I'm not able to explain here in detail, it was impossible for them to rejoin their husbands before the borders were closed with the beginning war. And as a reunion was impossible directly after the war, the separation often lasted until 1946 or even longer, as it was the case for the Alp family. Sometimes the spatial segregation also led to breakup and divorce. Divorce was, for the Gentile wives, often the only opportunity to avoid further ostracism and persecution. The Gestapo especially put pressure on these solitary women to divorce and to return to Volksgemeinschaft. Just to clarify, many women decided against the divorce, but some made the step not solely but often in order to protect their children or themselves. Others did it for their own convenience. Anyhow, pressure on mixed marriages to split up was high since 1933. Statistics for the city of Munich point to the fact that Kristallnacht had a major effect on the integrity of those marriages. In the Bavarian capital, the divorce rate of intermarried couples reached its climax after November 9. Half of all 117 divorces were submitted between Kristallnacht and the end of the year 1940. Of course, more than only one factor was responsible for this. The regime, for example, had facilitated legal conditions for Gentiles to divorce from Jews in summer of 1938. Nevertheless, the experience of personal threat during the violent events in November 1938, together with the fear of losing economic security in the forthcoming Aryanization process, had a major impact on this development. Mathilde Edelstein, for example, chose to divorce from her Jewish husband Ludwig in December 1938, when the party officials threatened her to take that draper shop in Munich away from them for being married to a Jew. Again, mainly mixed marriages with Jewish men were divorced. In Munich, the quota was near to 75%. In Hamburg, it was even higher. To conclude, the impact of Kristallnacht on mixed marriages was gendered to a high degree. Violence affected not solely but predominantly the spaces of Jewish men in those families. In consequence, intermarried Jewish men and their families were hit harder by and reacted more directly to Kristallnacht. At the end of my talk, I will give you a short impression how strongly the experience of Kristallnacht influenced intermarried Jews in their feeling of self-worth within their own family. When the Nazi hordes attacked his house in Kleinmachnow, Harry Löwenberg, who had converted to Christianity many years before, made himself and his Jewish descent responsible. I quote, "It was through me that they had been drawn into this. I felt they all were looking at me full of reproach, which was not the case. Reproach that I, with my existence and my origin as a member of the fillest of all races, had brought on this calamity." His first reaction was to withdraw from his family in order to protect them. And I quote again, "I went downstairs, put on my old grey overcoat and wanted to leave the house. I felt that my personal existence was now completely worthless, as I was not only unable to be of any use to my family and to take care of them, but was actually putting them in personal jeopardy by my presence. Only after a hard struggle, his family could persuade him to stay. This feeling of being responsible for the misery of their family often lasted for decades on intermarried Jews. Ludwig Edelstein, who was hardly disappointed of his wife for divorcing him after Kristallnacht, and he emigrated then, and who wanted to get compensation for losing the family draper's shop, in 1971 still felt guilty for his wife's situation back in 1938, when he declared before the compensation authorities, and I quote, "Nevertheless, I do not want my ex-wife to pay me compensation. I know exactly what it was like by the time for an Aryan woman to be married to a Jew." Thank you.
Differentiating once more events that we think we know all about already. And of course, you don't have to persuade me as a gender historian that gender is an important way of differentiating. And I just have one small question. I mean, you focused on, you said that the attack was basically against families where the husband was Jewish and the wife was so-called Aryan. But I do wonder what about, and you said it was because of property and destroying livelihood, destroying possibility of staying in Germany. But I do wonder about the other families, those who had like an Aryan husband and a Jewish wife. Maybe would it be possible to think that there's also some kind of male, I don't know, respect? I mean, not to go against Christian, Aryan, German men, or maybe cowardice? Or do you have any sources when attacking these places, and some of them were also attacked, where you have sources from the survivors or from the perpetrators in post-war trial who were commenting that it was something different to attack an Aryan German member of the Volksgemeinschaft just because he had a Jewish wife? Is there anything, or is it, the big absence of this?
Is it on? Yeah.
Yeah.
Actually, I don't have any sources regarding this question, but I think the general question about mixed marriages is that ideologically those families with Jewish wives are targeted more because of the fact that their children, who normally would be Aryan, will not be if they are together with a Jewish man. So this is really the focus of the politic against mixed marriages. And I think you might be right in all what you said, but I don't have proof of that. But what you can see is that it depended on the local action. So if there were local SR leaders who just wanted to destroy during the actions in the night all flats, they also took action against the flats of intermarried Jewish women. But and this was the case in smaller towns where they really attacked all Jews. But you can see that didn't happen so often than the other way around.
Mhm.
So and this is what I found out. It's not a real statistic, but if you look at into more than 100 files, and you have only some cases this way around, this is obvious.
Mhm. Thank you very much. The floor is open for more questions. Sandra, please. Yes.
Hi, I would like to ask about the children of those marriages and how much they were affected during the November Pogrom or just immediately after, if there were major consequences as well for them or not, how much were they regarded to one side or the other?
So basically there were orders not to attack Mischlinge, but in some places you have those attacks on Mischlinge, or like the one arrest I told, where they couldn't lay their hands on the father. They took the son, but he was released a couple of days afterwards. So often when they resisted, for example, there was also violence against them. And like I said, in sometimes this also was the case because the stormtroopers didn't differentiate. But the general order was not to attack them.
Here.
Thank you. I enjoyed your presentation very much. I'm Stefanie from the University of Southern Denmark in Gruner. We know each other. When we saw these maps before that one of your predecessors showed us, it was obvious that the violence was widespread all over Germany. You used examples also from all over Germany, not only Bavaria, Berlin, Ruhrgebiet, and so on and so forth. Would you say that there would, in spite of that, be variations in the patterns regionally inside Germany?
This is a hard question. Of course there are, and I think this will be very interesting when we listen to the next presentation of Wolf Gruner, because in some cities the raids were happening later. So you didn't have actions in the night because the orders came too late. For example, in Memmingen or in Kempten, so in the Allgäu region. And then the raid and the violence was at the same time. And so this is why in those regions the situation for the families got even, I would not say worse, but really bad, because the whole family was there. They came to arrest the man, and the violence was conducted directly in the home. It was there was no first and second wave. In other cities, we have these two different timelines, like in Berlin, from the case of Kleinmachnow, from Harry Löwenberg. So he had the opportunity to do something against it because he knew that they already happened something, and then he reacted. So this is one finding, and the other one is that that's also about bystanders or helpers, or it was not the same in every case or in every city. So you find some memoirs where people are telling you that, are writing about that they got help or they were warned by local politicians, for example, who knew the family in smaller towns, in the outskirts. So this was certainly different than it was in bigger cities. But it's not. I would not say it's a pattern. So it's always, you always have to look at the case.
Or maybe yes. So we have time for one more question. Yes, please, Anja.
Thank you for a very interesting talk. I have one question for you which crossed my mind. and it deals with intermixed marriages where the Jewish partner had a different citizenship than a German citizenship, or I'm thinking about a Polish citizenship. And if yes, how did it affected them, and did it affected them in a different way? Because I'm asking, because in my own research I sometimes came across examples of Jewish refugees with a Polish citizenship who were stranded in the 1930s and fled to Poland, who came together with their non-Jewish German wife. That's why I'm asking.
So in general, you can say that with Eastern European nationalities had better chances. For example, women who were married to men who had a Polish nationality after the German nationality was, many of them got the German nationality, and then it was removed from them, and those women also loses the status of a German national. And some of them are also deported in 1938 to Poland. Not all of them. So there was a difference, but mainly it had influence after 38. So because there was a ranking in the nationalities. So if you were Polish, it was better than if you were like from the Netherlands, for example. So this made a difference, but you always have to look at the time and what question.
Wolf, last question here, behind you.
Yeah, thank you, Max, very much to make us think about this, the very different effect by gender on these mixed marriages. So this was, I think, very important to learn about. One question I have, did you ever come across that there is some reflection about members of these families who are mixed, let's say wider family, that they are perpetrators among the Aryan side, and how is there a discussion? How did the families cope with this situation? Did you ever came across these incidents?
In general, not in Kristallnacht, or
in general.
In general.
In general.
I mean, if Kristallnacht better, but
yeah. So I would say it's true that most of those families lost their social contacts. Let's say not entirely, some of them did, but in wide parts. So what I was talking about and what Mary talked about, I think these are exceptions, but I think there were more exceptions than until now historians thought. So you have those opportunities to enter Gentile spaces, to get better chances, or have opportunities, but it's not always the case. So we have many families where the brother, for example, or the man of the sister, or the sister was very persuaded National Socialist, and they completely, the ties were disrupted completely. And there are many cases like this. And this is also a problem, just by the way, for the time after the war, because in those families, either they don't talk about that, or the disruption continues.
Mm-hmm.
So, but I think just to give you a short impression, because I think this is a non-topic.
Okay. So if there's no more questions, I might recommend a novel on this topic, which is called Landgericht by Ursula Krechel, and I'm not sure whether it has been translated. I will find that out in the break. It's one of the best books and descriptions of what happens to these mixed marriages, even if they survive. I mean, they survive and they get separated, come back after the war, and it's what happens after the war. I mean, the destruction, post-war destruction. This is, I think, very, very impressive. You want to comment on that?
No, not on the novel, but I do want to ask if Jewish aid organizations. Oh, I'm so sorry. I want to ask if Jewish aid organizations had a particular take on these mixed marriages, and if in any way their work and intervention, both in terms of providing resources on the spot as well as aiding in immigration, were all impacted by the fact that some of these families had non-Jewish members.
Yes, and both during the time of the regime and afterwards. And in the 30s, basically, this also was divided by race. So the Jewish organizations only helped, or only were allowed to help those people who were Jews by race, and the other ones, let's say that the German parts, or non-Jewish parts, had to ask the churches, like the church organizations, or the Quakers for help. So this was very well organized. It was a kind of help between those organizations. So they knew if somebody came to them, they had to send the wife, for example, to the church organizations. But it was hard because they didn't focus on helping the Gentile parts to emigrate. They focused on helping the Jewish part to emigrate because, of course, this was more important. And some families decided not to emigrate if there wasn't enough money that both could go. So this really could affect also the fate of the whole family.
Okay, thank you very much. So thank you again, Max, for this very insightful paper. And we now move on to our last paper before the lunch break. And of course, I do not have to introduce Wolf Gruner again, who has already been introduced. But I think we didn't mention that he's also a professor of history and has a chair in Jewish studies here at the University of Southern California. And I would like to add to this that, and not only in my eyes, he is, I think, one of the most innovative scholars and thinkers in international Holocaust research. And this is not only proven by the 10 books he has written on the Holocaust, where he really enhanced especially our understanding of the mechanisms of persecution between top-down and bottom-up. But also he's now turning the perspective and looking more at Jewish responses within these persecution process. And this is from the Jewish responses, this new project where we will hear his paper now, which deals with the attack on the Jewish homes as a specific place within the events of Kristallnacht, and the Jewish reactions to it. Wolf, the floor is yours.
Stefanie. So this is kind of in a way a circle, because the inspiration for this paper I actually got when I came here to USC in 2008, when I got my job here, and for my inaugural kind of speech, I started for the first time really intensively to look at the Shoah Foundation testimonies. And one thing struck me, that these testimonies, almost all of them, describe the devastation of private homes. And I thought at the time, when you go back to the literature, you don't even really see much of this. Sometimes it's mentioned, but more in passing. There's not really something, people don't deal really, scholars especially, with this problem. So this on one hand, scholarly literature, but also in public, people always think about Kristallnacht as the event with the destruction of the synagogues and the destruction of shops. So we are used to photographs like these, and I just give you some examples. But then, during the last decades, we kind of encountered some new sources, and especially post-war trials got us much more insights in kind of the destruction, which included then more and more also private homes, apartments. But there was also, again, no really systematic look into this. And I think what I would try to do here is really to at least give a glimpse, this is a preliminary investigation, into the scale, the intensity, and the impact of the destruction of private homes. And similarly, I think
what is also underestimated and overlooked is actually how the Jews reacted towards the situation when not just their livelihood, they are physically attacked, but that there is an intrusion in the last refuge into their private homes. So, as I already said, we have these photographs, and they give really, in my view, now a very wrong impression of the kind of extent of these events. And when we look at numbers we actually obtained over time about the pogrom, many people deal with numbers which originate from the Nazis. And mostly we have the number which is outdated, but it's still often cited, is that Goebbels brought these numbers 2 days after the pogrom, about 76 demolished synagogues, as well as 7,500 damaged stores and 35 murdered Jews. This is a number which is often cited in the literature, which is now outdated. We know that way over 1,000 synagogues were destroyed. However, we have no actual number about the shops, and much less about destroyed apartments, rental apartments and private homes. So I found a kind of a mention of an interesting number. Here you have the district Schneidemühl in Pomerania, and it struck me when I saw this, the correlation. Look at this, it's 63 shops, but 231 apartments were destroyed. This is 4 times the number of shops and 10 times the number, or 40 times the number of the synagogues. That's kind of, and when I saw this number, I thought, why I do Holocaust research for 30 years, especially in Germany. Why I never came across this, why I never looked into this. So I started to look a little bit more, especially for this conference, and immediately this report, which is from December, is actually confirmed by other numbers I could find. So there is a number from the city of Nuremberg, which is very similar. So there, attackers destroyed several synagogues, badly damaged 70 stores, and demolished 236 houses. That's Nuremberg. So there's a rural area, and here we have a city. So when one starts to pay more attention to the attacks of private homes, evidence quickly emerges from everywhere in Germany, everywhere. And even weeks before this, the Kristallnacht actually starts, in mid-October 1938, the police in Marburg already reports attacks on private homes, on several private homes in Marburg. When the information kind of spread that von Rath died, during the night from November 7 to 8, Nazi party members intruded several Jewish homes in Bebra, a small town, forced the Jews out of their beds, and destroyed everything from furniture, curtain, to lamps. This was 2 days before the pogrom. 2 days later, the same Jewish homes were attacked again. This time all furniture was taken out, brought to the city square, and burned in a bonfire. So when you look at the evidence, during this 1.5 day violent event, private homes were attacked in a multitude of cities. Just to name a few: Cologne, Duisburg, Bochum, Essen, Oberhausen, Hagen, Königsberg, Chemnitz, Beuthen, Hindenburg. These are bigger cities. In the capital of Berlin, young uniformed men burglarized countless apartments, especially in the northern and eastern part of the city. There's an interesting report by the Joint, and the Joint says in Rostock, all Jewish homes had been devastated. In Mannheim, 90% of all homes. In Nuremberg, almost all Jewish houses. We heard about the 236. In Düsseldorf, and this is a newer account which kind of confirms the contemporary Joint account. This is from a new book on Düsseldorf. The material destruction included 3/4 of the Jewish apartments. The same is true for smaller towns. Jewish homes were attacked in Weißwasser, in Bad Muskau, in Saxonia. There, SA men hacked with axes the home furnishings into pieces and threw furniture out of windows of several Jewish apartments. In various towns in Thuringia, the district Meiningen, Jewish homes had been attacked. If you go from Thuringia to the northern western part of Germany, in Geldern near the Dutch border, the SS burned first the synagogue, then destroyed 2 Jewish shops, and then all Jewish homes in this small town. Many more examples could be given here. However, what I think is even more devastating for me is not the scale, it is actually the intensity of the violence. The destruction which you face when you read these accounts, when you read these reports, is so intense. It is and it was astonishing. In the video testimonies of the Shoah Foundation, many survivors described how the attackers intruded their homes. And you got a little bit of glimpse in the very beginning of the conference. And interesting is they all independently, either for villages or towns, use a very similar vocabulary. And I just want to quote some which are used throughout many testimonies. It felt like a bomb went off. They smashed everything inside. They slit the feather beds. They smashed all the glasses. They threw stuff through the windows. So in countless accounts you find this. And then when we go back to revisit photographs of this event, then suddenly some photographs get new meanings. So for example, I knew this photograph all the time, but I looked at this, that there are kind of German people looking at the destruction. But what I actually see is that some, probably at night or in the early morning, all the furniture of the apartment was actually thrown through the windows onto the street. So you see things differently suddenly. And I was looking then for are there photographs of apartments that survived? And I found 2 from this small town, Burg Steinfurt. And this one I used for the program of the conference because I thought this is really a different perspective. However, now, after doing more research, I think actually this is a euphemism. Because it's just kind of like plundering, getting some stuff out. But what the actual accounts are talking about is really with axes, destroying all the furniture, throwing it out of the window. So, for example, in Beuthen, the merchant Martin Fröhlich came home in the afternoon of the, November 10th. The door was broken, a fallen wardrobe blocked the doorway. When he entered the apartment, he must wade through knee-deep shards and rags in his apartment. Everything had been smashed to pieces: glass, china, clocks, piano, violin, the violin, furniture, chairs, lamps, paintings. Realizing that this flat was inhabitable, Fröhlich felt like hit by a stroke, and he started crying, as he mentions in a letter to his daughter. I'm very pleased to share with you some photos who survived, which kind of give you a little bit of a glimpse of what happened inside flats. These are photos which were provided to me just before the conference by Christoph Kreuzmüller, who actually wanted to participate but is doing a big new exhibition at the Jewish Museum in Berlin, and they didn't let him go. And so at least in this way he is present at the conference, that we can share these photographs he found for the new exhibition of the Jewish Museum. Maybe there's another one. Yeah. Just to give you an idea and how this looked like. So, as short-term consequences of the violent night in villages as well as in big cities, countless homeless Jews sought shelter with families within the same town or neighboring cities, sometimes also with non-Jewish neighbors. But in many cases with family or distant relatives. And I want to mention just one case, because Bruce Neuberger is here. The Holzers, which were relatives of his grandmother, were driven out of their home in Traunstein. So they moved to Munich to live in the apartment of his grandparents, which was practically too small. There were conflicts later on and everything. But they were kind of welcomed by the Neuberger family. They added to a letter Anna Neuberger was writing to her children in the United States on November 12th, quote, "My loved ones," these are the children in the US from the Neuberger family, "as you can see, we are still with your mom. Don't worry, she's doing well considering the circumstances," because her husband was in the concentration camp Dachau. "We will remain here until we can return home. But of course, the best thing would be to go to America right away," unquote. The nationwide attacks on private homes did not go unnoticed by international observers. The Swiss merchant René Jouvet traveled through Bavaria and visited Jewish friends the day before the violent night. After the dinner, he slept at the hotel. The next day he wanted to visit them. He encountered the door unhinged. The furniture was thrown in the garden. Water was everywhere in the house. The stairs were broken. All doors had been hacked to pieces with axes. Valuable paintings had been cut with knives. And his friends, husband and wife, both had been terribly beaten. And his host, his friend, died the next day in the hospital. The Swiss consul in Cologne heard from police sources that in Duisburg, the vandals pushed through the windows not only furniture, but also the tenants of these apartments, which cost 3 Jews their lives. So what we now see also differently is that the attack on the private homes is enabling not only beating, but also cases of murder, and as well, which is also very kind of under-analyzed, cases of rape and sexual violence towards Jewish women and girls. For example, there are some cases documented in Niederwörn, Linz, and Duisburg. So from the sources, which I couldn't present all here, it looks like this was a mass phenomenon across Germany. And the question is, was it random violence, or was there kind of a direct order? I don't have the time to actually revisit all the decrees. I just want to share that as well as in pre-program decrees, as well as in post-program decrees, the destruction of home is equally mentioned with the destruction of shops and stores. We just didn't notice. We always looked at the shops. So what I found kind of very important is when you look at all these accounts, you get a different understanding why people actually, so many people committed suicide, because the attack on their private homes, I think, plays a big role. It has a different impact. Also the massive decision to flee. But then, and this is my second point, also the spike in Jewish reactions towards the violence. So how did Jews react to the widespread assault? There were different ways. Jewish communities, for example, immediately petitioned Nazi authorities, like the Vienna community, and petitioned Eichmann's central office to stop the violence, the mass arrests of Jewish males in Vienna, and again, the demolition of so many apartments. During the pogrom, the stormtroopers also raided throughout Germany retraining camps where Jewish youth was preparing for the immigration to Palestine. There also facilities were kind of destroyed. The Jewish youth and their instructors were often, in most cases, arrested. So the German umbrella organization intervened at Gestapo headquarters against the destruction of the camps, and actually successful. They played the Gestapo versus the security service, and because they were important for the immigration, these instructors were actually released from concentration camp to resume immigration training. Individual Jews responded in a variety of ways. They saved religious objects, or private goods from shops. They also documented the devastation. And what I just showed with you or shared, these are photographs of the owners of these flats. So this is in itself an act of resistance to document these, the devastation. And I want to share a few more of these photographs with you. This is a different apartment. So you see, Jews kind of document their own apartments, but then there were also others who documented the destruction outside, like the destruction of shops, for example. And you see, this is not related to the shops, but here you see, for example, this is a photograph where we don't know who took this picture. But what you can see, that this is an angle which is not an official angle, so to speak. This is done from across the street, from the second floor, to document what actually happened there. And you see again, this is stuff thrown out of the apartments. And I found police sources that Jews either photographed or took notes about addresses of destroyed shops in Berlin. And at least 5 Jews were arrested and handed over to the Gestapo for acts hostile to the German state because they documented the crimes. Some Jews criticized the pogrom as barbaric in public, as in Frankfurt, Henriette Schäfer. She entered her neighbor's shop and after a short conversation about the fact that everything had been destroyed, Henriette Schäfer snapped, quote, "This is not the people, but the government. They are all blackguards, scamps, and criminals. Hitler is the biggest bandit. If I could, I would poison them all." She got 6 months in prison for this remark. Similarly, in Augsburg, Josephine Fleischmann told several women during the days after the pogrom in a nursing store that equally as now, the SA had murdered Jews during the annexation of Austria. In Frankfurt, Ernst Nachmann, who was just released from the Buchenwald concentration camp because he was a front soldier, he started to criticize the violence in the concentration camp in public, and then he called in front of witnesses on the street Hitler a kelef, which I found out that this is in Hebrew dog, right? And a scamp and a tramp and a cruel guy. Then there were leaflets, there were leaflets and there were protest letters authored by Jews. And the Vienna Gestapo noted that in the second half of November, there's a wave of anonymous letters, which obviously written with genuine Jewish impudence to disparage the Führer and the party. And just to share one letter with you, "Dear sweet Gestapo, we will soon beat your ass. Until the German mud race will arrive in our ghetto alley, Hosanna to our Greenspan, the hero boy from Paris. Where now the murder frenzy unfolds, you will soon come into a big fuss. Gun down the dog, Hitler." And this is not just some, let's say, verbal assault, but we have also now some documentation that there was also physical self-defense. You heard this testimony from Ruth Winnig in the very beginning that the stormtrooper went after her sister. So she talks in the interview then later that her grandmother actually defended with a kitchen knife her sister and stabbed the guy. And another case happened in a retraining camp in Urfeld, which was raided by stormtroopers, and they beat up the boys, and then they started to beat up the girls. And when it was supposed to be her turn, Daisy Gronowski headbutted a stormtrooper in the stomach using a jiu-jitsu trick, which she had learned to defend herself as a Zionist youth group, Hashomer HaSair. Taking advantage of his surprise, she twisted the knife out of his hand and stabbed him into the stomach. Since I'm running out of time, I want to just conclude. So recently, these photos surfaced which provide visual evidence about the enormous destruction of private homes of German Jews, but also about the resistance because they were taken by the victims themselves to document the crimes. I talked about other ways of how Jews protested and resisted. And I think when we think about the enormous extent and intensity of the devastation, we might think differently also about the obviously euphemistic term Kristallnacht, but there may be some different validity to this term because of the destruction in the glass of all these apartments. So it was not just shop windows there. We get insights into the unexpected scale and widespread nature. And I think we can only start to imagine the enormous emotional, physical, material, and psychological toll this had on the attacked Jewish families inside their homes. The loss of all belongings, of home and privacy, must have meant for the attacked Jews, literally, or at least virtually, the loss of the last resort. And I think only this can really explain why so many people immediately felt there is no future in Germany. Thank you very much.
I wanted to make a very smart remark, but I will stop doing this here, and maybe if I have time at the end, or maybe in the coffee break. Let's start right away with the question. Thank you, Wolf. Sorry, because there's so many people. Okay. Yes, there.
Lori Barron, San Diego State. I just wondered if you have statistics on how many deaths. There's the traditional statistic of 91 that everyone seems to have, but it seems to be much higher. And one other related thing, which comes up in a clip I'm going to show tomorrow, is the attack on hospitals, on Jewish hospitals.
Old age homes. I will start collecting, otherwise we will not make it. Yes,
okay,
exactly.
Thank you very much. I wanted to ask you about the sexual assaults. I also read your paper, and you wrote that the Nazis were tried and judged, meaning that the women went and filed a report because on the one hand it means it's an act of rebellion, but on the other hand it means that they still believe in the system. So I was wondering about that.
Okay, there was one more there, and then those two, and then we go over to the other side.
Matt Verdugo, Texas Holocaust and Genocide Commission. I was curious if you came across any testimony from neighbors, non-Jewish German neighbors, especially in the apartments. Having been a tenant of a German apartment life myself years ago, I'm just curious what the neighbors thought when it was all going down, if you came across any testimony like that.
Your neighbor, and then those two, and then...
I appreciate very much your comment about how historians have paid far more attention to the destruction of synagogues and shops. But in terms of popular representation, the first images that come to my mind would be from Germany, the semi-autobiographical young adult novel that's widely taught in the United States, at least in middle school level, the novel Friedrich, which has 2 chapters on Kristallnacht, and the Jewish mother is murdered in her apartment once the apartment is destroyed, and then similarly Europa, also out of Germany, which near the beginning of the film, the Jewish sister is murdered on the Shabbat table on the eve of the protagonist's bar mitzvah.
Okay, and 2 more, and then the first year. We will get there.
Well, I have a math question. You have the number of homes versus synagogues and shops, etc. But what's the percentage? Because there are going to be many more homes than there are synagogues. So I would want to know cohort percentage, because I'll bet they had a much higher percentage of destroying synagogues. Probably next would be destroying shops, and then my guess, I would just guess that there's a smaller percentage of homes being destroyed, but you're the man who knows, I don't.
And behind you, and then...
Wolf, I have this sentence from Heydrich's order after Kristallnacht, and after he states that synagogues are to be burned, only the case when there's no damage to the surrounding area. And then it says, Geschäfte und Wohnungen von Juden dürfen nicht zerstört, nur zerstört, nicht geplündert werden. Und die Polizei ist angewiesen, die Durchführung dies an Orden zu überwachen und Plünderer festzunehmen. So the question is about the plundering vis-a-vis the theft. So you pointed to a destruction and not to theft. I was just wondering if you could unpack that.
So now.
This could be another presentation.
No. We have Let him answer the first round, and then we have a second round. Otherwise, it will be too much to answer. We had 7 questions now.
Okay, so number of deaths. We have no exact number, and that's why I kind of mourned a little bit to have not Christopher Kreuzmüller here, because actually we planned a project some years ago that at some point there needs to be a kind of an account of how many people actually were murdered during the program. And we wanted to start with Berlin, so we went to the cemetery to get to see how many graves are there in after Kristallnacht. The problem was that he then got the job at the museum, and this is more important. So this is a project for the future. The actual numbers, most historians agree now, the Nazi numbers are way too low. The biggest number what the Nazis have is 91. I did 15 years ago, just in a library, taking books about different localities from Germany, and within only 60 books, I found over 100 people murdered. So if somebody would do just doing books, we would have a bigger number, plus the numbers of people who died several days later because of the wounds, the people in the concentration camps, maybe several hundreds. So I think in total we might have a number of almost 1,000 people probably. I mean, but I think this is the next step what we need to do. Yeah. Sexual assault in women. So I think there is a lot more than we think there is, first of all. So I just wanted to point this out. This specific case is in the paper I mentioned the Nazi trials. So the Nazis didn't like this idea that they would kind of do race development, and that's why they were brought on trial. So I think in this case it's more about denunciations by their own party, Nazi party members, then kind of Jewish women which were attacked, then going to, let's say, a court or police. However, beyond sexual violence, we have Jews after the pogrom going to police stations and file reports about lost goods. So it's not so exactly what you say. There is some belief in the system, but they also know, I think what we sometimes miss when we look back, everything looks so streamlined, it is only radicalizing. This was a highly heterogeneous society. People were acting differently. So people had also different experiences. So it's not naive to go to a place and ask for your rights, because at some point there was more support than we know. And for example, this leads me to the next question, the neighbors. So when I did my research on the ground about the Jewish resistance, I used local files people usually don't look at, police reports, trials, and I found a lot of non-Jewish protest against the violence during the pogrom, actually. And not because of economic reasons, as you can sometimes read, really for either pro-Jewish, regular humanistic reasons, just because the violence was outrageous. So about the plundering. So there is that you can't steal stuff. So there's a variety. And there was also, it was not that people would just stay in the streets and look. I have police reports that there were huge discussions in the afternoon of the program in Berlin, on the streets, in Charlottenburg, in Kreuzberg, in Schöneberg. And there were people arrested because they said, this is not right, the party has done all this distraction. And there were discussions going on, a lot of critique there. I mean, I would not say this is overwhelming, but much more than we actually anticipated. This is a source problem. We never had these sources before. Films. I think film is an art form, and film usually, or art anticipates often what the scholars need 20 years to get there.
Yes.
And so in this case, I'm not surprised, and it is, for example, also when you just look at, many people don't like this, the Holocaust series.
Yes.
There is, for example, a scene about sexual violence in there, which you don't expect, which I think, this was, for me, this was an eye-opener to see this at the time, yeah, so far ahead. Although they have no destruction of the apartment, they do the shop, yeah. Okay, so I can just say this, yeah. And then percentages. That's a good question. This would be my next step, actually, to do numbers of inhabitants, number of apartments, and to see the correlation. I would probably also go in the same direction as you, that the percentage is much higher in synagogues than with apartments. However, I gave you some numbers of entirely destroyed, 90% destroyed, 3/4 destroyed. That's a huge number. And what I wanted to get at is just attention to the enormous number of destroyed properties there. I mean, we have to probably think about tens of thousands, yeah? And so, but I think this is the next step for the research. And then theft. Yeah, so there is also, from my police report sources, a lot more plundering than we normally see and read about. This was also a mass phenomenon, and in the accounts about the apartments, there's always plunder. There's always looting. So people use, interesting is, there are two forms of plunder. One is the attackers who smash everything. They usually take valuable small stuff. Yeah, what is it? A fountain pen, a gold fountain pen, jewelry, money. But then often when they throw stuff out of the window, the rest of the population takes the feather bed, it takes some furniture which is not totally destroyed. So, so there is a variety of how people loot and plunder.
So now we take the question from this side, and then we finish.
I'm Professor of Fine Arts, Ruth Weisberg from USC. And I've always been, very impacted by that iconic photograph of the shop window being smashed. That's the image, that I think most of us carry around as the idea of Kristallnacht. I came home last week from a trip back east, and I discovered some homeless people had camped in my driveway. And I live in a live-work shop with an apartment up above. I'm an artist. It's my studio. And I and another neighbor asked them to please leave, and a woman. And we asked them in the morning, and they left, and we moved the furniture out of the driveway. And later that afternoon, someone smashed my shop window, totally smashed it. It was like a distant echo, but it was an echo of how one might feel. And I really wanted to share that because it was pretty, one window, 8 feet by 5 feet, but it's pretty devastating emotionally to be attacked in that way.
Thank you for sharing that story. Wendy Lauer, McKenna. Nice to see you. That's fabulous. I learned a lot. A couple of, one point very quickly. Richard Evans in his trilogy, the second volume, I guess, on the Third Reich here, I think he estimates about 1,000 deaths in the Kristallnacht pogrom. So that's consistent with what you were saying. The fact that some businesses, and in light of this comment here, are also homes. I mean, if they're private, they're family businesses and they're living right above, that even the numbers for businesses might also include homes, and just that's something I wonder if that's something you encountered. And then those Jewish businesses, they're most vulnerable because people know their family businesses and they know they're Jewish. How do they know where they live? I mean, if they're on the second floor of an apartment building, it's a little bit more complicated in a big city than, for instance, in a town where the community is smaller. So do you have any documentation on how they kind of
there's... Okay, then we finish. Yeah, Wolf.
Oh, am I on? Okay. Yeah, thanks, Ruth, for sharing this. I actually, this would be, I tried to, I planned, I had this already noted, Wendy, to sneak this in with the shop, in the, because I cut it out of my talk, it is in a paper. So that's totally correct. So many shopkeepers live either in the back or on top of their stores, especially in villages, in small towns. And so I have accounts from small towns where exactly happens. They smashed first the shop and then they go in the back or upstairs, and then the apartment is equally devastated. So I think in the number of shops there is really includes also number of apartments. It goes even further. I didn't mention, which I also have in the paper, Jewish institutions. There were a lot of apartments in orphanages of the instructors and in Jewish youth institutions, in religious institutions, in schools. So next to synagogues there were usually apartments. They were all destroyed usually. And so this is also a hidden number which is kind of attached to these kind of targets. So I think this is, in general, we see a lot, almost everywhere Jewish families are affected. The list is, so when we have Jewish institutions, that's easy. Shops, that's also. I'm not at the, this is just preliminary. We have in the testimonies sometimes in smaller towns that people came with lists. They say they just went to the list, they had the names of the addresses and everything. And then but there's also some mentioning of that sometimes they didn't realize that this was a Jewish family, so they went to the next door and then smashed there everything. So it was not kind of complete and thoroughly organized. We have to have in mind that often this was pretty kind of a quick evolvement, because this was ordered at night and the people were not really prepared for this, so they had to do this on the fly. So what I find in accounts sometimes is that during the night they don't attack the apartments because they don't know, and then they come back the next day because then they have lists and they suddenly, and there are different ways how Jewish families were registered, and so that they got the names via professions. There's a whole variety how they could get hold of addresses. Plus, the Nazi Party organizations often had lists about especially the Jewish property and premises. And in Berlin, at least the shops were marked. And then neighbors would also denounce. I mean, so there's a lot, but I think this needs also to be explored more.